2 weeks ago, I recorded a podcast segment where I talked about the Curtis Joseph trade all the way back in 1995. And I asked fans a question. I asked them whether or not the Oilers had actually won that trade over the long term. I dug into some of the draft history and some of the history related to to all the different resources, all the different assets that changed hands during that trade. And I think that there is very good reason to ask that question. But one thing that a lot of people didn't actually seem to understand very well was why this question was being asked in the first place. And so, of course, as I said in the video, for those who actually bothered to watch it, the point of that video wasn't to run down Curtis Joseph or anything of the like, or to blame the ruination of the franchise on Curtis Joseph. Of course not. As a matter of fact, I'm a huge fan of Curtis Joseph, and I always have been. I do think that he was a player that Oilers fans were very lucky to have on the roster for any period of time. Whether or not the Oilers would have been better off to draft a different goaltender earlier, a guy like, say, Jose Teodor or Marty Turco, and keep all of those assets and have all of those things to build with, that's completely a what-if question. The fact of the matter is that the Oilers did actually make out reasonably well out of that trade. I mean, as I mentioned it, they definitely won that trade. And so the question of that was definitely not the value of Curtis Joseph as a player. But the question of that was whether or not the Oilers had managed their resources well over the long term. And unfortunately, there were some people that didn't really seem to understand that part of the conversation. A question that was raised on a number of occasions with people saying, it's like, well, why does this even matter? It was 20 years ago. Well, the reason why it matters is because it shows us the kind of impact that poor management of resources can have on a team. And the simple fact of the matter is that there were opportunities that were missed there. I can respect the argument of anybody that brought it up, that the Oilers did win, 2 huge playoff victories during Curtis Joseph's tenure with the team. And of course, there absolutely is no guarantee that they would have been able to do that with a different goaltender, even with a better cast of players around him. I think that the argument that one bird in hand is worth 2 in the bush, that's a very compelling argument here. But the one argument that I will not accept under any circumstances whatsoever is the argument that this doesn't matter. Because the simple fact of the matter is that it does matter if you can learn anything from it. And I think that we can learn a lot from the way that the franchise has been managed. And we can learn a lot about the way that the franchise could or should be managed now. And so to that end, I am going to go back to something here that actually didn't make the cut last week. The video wound up running too long and I wasn't able to include this part, and it does kind of explain a little bit as to why these questions are being asked. And so, I'm going to refer back to a speech, once again, by General Bruce Clark. For those who are new to the podcast, General Bruce Clark is perhaps one of the most experienced military leaders in American history, but also perhaps one of the least heralded. For those who bother to talk about such things, he's not exactly a household name. But the fact is that he was a general in World War I, in World War II, in Korea. He was an American general in Vietnam. And one thing that he focused on during that entire time was the training of officers. And so in terms of leadership and management, General Bruce Clark was a man that absolutely knows what he's talking about. And so let's refer back to something that Bruce Clark did talk about when he gave a commencement address at the graduation for the American Tank Academy. So let's refer back to something that General Clark did say when he gave the commencement address for the graduation of officers at one of the top American military academies. This one in particular had to do with tank warfare. But he gave this speech where he talked about, the way that people progress up the rungs of the ladder of success in life. And he said that the best way to judge a person is not where they end their life at, which rung they end their life at, but how many they manage to climb. And he said that as people go through their lives, there are ceilings that often form over top of people, and they can get that far, and then they can get no further. And he gave what I thought was an extremely extremely illuminating list of different things that people do during their lives that cause these things to happen. And so, I'm going to read that. It's not in the order that he gave it in the speech, it's just in the order that I wrote it down. And so, that list begins with number 1, wrong decisions. Number 2, and this is what we were talking about last week, wasted opportunities. Number 3, deterioration of attitude or enthusiasm. Number 4, excesses. Number 5, lack of self-control. Number 6, lack of honesty of purpose. Number 7, and this is what we're going to talk about this week, tendency towards lowered standards. But I'm going to continue with the rest of this list here. Number 8, poor ethics. Number 9, loss of self-respect. This is going to become a factor this week as well. Number 10, lack of ability to express orally or in writing. Insufficient loyalty, up or down. I just lost count. Poor associations. Loss of motivation or ambition. Unfortunate family situations. Wrong scale of values. Deterioration of physical condition. Failure in carrying out responsibility. Bad habits. Poor financial management. Disregard of rules. Procrastination, or failure to keep up with advancements in one's field. Now, as you listen to that whole list, there is one thing that should stand out to you, is that pretty much almost all of these items are things that people are in control of. And I honestly do believe that, because organizations are made up of so many different individuals, I think that a well-run organization actually falls into, rather I should say, just about any organization can fall into the same pitfalls as an individual. And in particular this week, what I actually want to focus on, I'm going to do something that will probably not win me any more friends within the Oilers fandom than I already may have. But I am going to actually address the role that the fandom has within the organization, influencing management and doing things, and things such as that. So in particular, I am going to refer back to one item on this list in particular, and that is the tendency towards lowered standards. And it really pains me to say this, and I don't think that it's true of all Oilers fans, but I think that in all honesty, I think that it is true of at least a segment of Oilers fans. I think that you do see a tendency towards lowered standards. And the idea that we could actually look at, this Curtis Joseph trade as the best thing that even could have happened. And so many people are unwilling to even engage with the possibility that there may have been better options for the Oilers to pursue at that time. I think that it just basically accepts that bad management decisions are part of what makes up this team. And the simple fact of the matter is that when fans are willing to accept that, that takes away all of the incentive for team management to perform any better. Now, I think that one thing that people do talk about hockey history as it relates to the Edmonton Oilers pretty much agreed is that at some point or another, given what the economics of the game were at that time, given simply the fact of the matter is that the Oilers had so many stars on those dynasty teams who were all at some point going to be coming around demanding big raises and become unaffordable for a team in what was then called a small market. I mean, it still is a small market now, but back then the kind of financial supports to make those teams competitive that exist in the league now, they didn't exist back then. And so the generally accepted maxim is that the dynasty was going to go away, and I do believe that that is true. And of course, what happened in Edmonton was that the dynasty went away in such a spectacular fashion, stripped away almost entirely within approximately about a 2 to 3 year period, that this was a team that was sent from being the top hockey team in the world to pretty much being the dregs of the league for a few seasons, until finally they were able to kind of cobble together a team that could at least be competitive enough to make the playoffs. And I do think that that affected, kind of the collective self-esteem of the fandom quite a bit. And there was evidence that was presented of that periodically throughout the next few years. You know, I do remember, in particular, one thing that stands out in my memory was, I believe this might have been, you know, the 2002-2003 season. And at the end of the year, this was the last of those years that Edmonton was drawing Dallas in the first round of the playoffs. Every single year. Kind of felt like no matter where Edmonton finished in the standings, there was Dallas, and with the exception of on one occasion, Dallas always sent Edmonton packing, and it was extremely frustrating for Edmonton fans. And I remember reading this story about the Oilers being eliminated from the playoffs. And this reporter that wrote it, I don't remember who wrote the story, but the one thing that stood out in my memory about that story was he wrote about some fans talking on the LRT on the way from the game. And, you know, they were just saying to themselves, they're saying to each other, yeah, we suck. It was like, yeah, we suck, and we accept that. And so there you see another item from General Clark's list, the loss of self-respect. Even the deterioration of attitude and enthusiasm. And as much as I hate to point my finger at the fans for anything that was beyond their control, I think that deterioration, those three things coming together, I think that it did in a lot of ways write team management basically a license to manage the team poorly. And I think that you could almost make the argument that that reflected directly, in the Oilers' historically poor performance at the draft. I mean, if you want to know the best way to create an organization that will not succeed, the best way to do that, I mean, if there is such a thing, is to foster an attitude amongst its stakeholders that the organization is not expected to succeed. I mean, it really hurts to say it, but honestly, it kind of reminds me of that Lady Gaga episode of The Simpsons where they had the billboard for Springfield. It was the, Springfield, the little town that can't and won't. And amongst a lot of the fans at a certain period of time, it kind of felt like, the Edmonton Oilers were kind of like the little train that can't and won't. And honestly, I do kind of get that vibe from some of the fans right now. And honestly, I think the argument that it doesn't matter, if the franchise has made poor or even questionable decisions in the past, is the kind of thing that gives it, it's the idea that it was acceptable that this franchise was ever poorly run. And that's not an attitude that ever should have been acceptable, and I honestly do not believe that it should be acceptable now. I think that we need to have higher standards for this management, and I think that if we're going to have those higher standards, we need to be able to look back through the history of this franchise to learn the lessons the previous examples of poor, questionable, or even debatable management teach us. For those fans who want to have that conversation, I welcome your comments. I very much do welcome them. I think it's an important conversation that we need to have. And for those who don't want to have the conversation, well, I mean, I'm not going to forbid you from commenting, but I think that we do have to recognize that really your contributions are not going to be very valuable if you're not even willing to engage with the argument. I mean, I think that we can all safely say that we want to have a better hockey team than we have had over the past few seasons. The only way to get that is to learn the lessons that the past teaches us. While it's definitely not my intention to be dismissive of anybody, I do hope that that idea is enough to convince some of the holdouts out there, to either come on board and get involved with this conversation, or at least let the people who want to have it have that conversation.